Hermetic philosophy, like most philosophies, has a kind of founding myth. The oft-repeated story goes something like this. When rediscovered, Ficino immediately halted translating his complete works of Plato to render and publish the Corpus Hermeticum. Of course, this rush was due to the great spiritual and philosophical value of that text. After all, Hermes Trismegistus represented primordial, perennial wisdom. Appearing in 1471, the tractates of the Hermetica introduced a new philosophy that in part gave rise to modernity and introduced a new form of spiritual philosophy into Europe. Of course, this story is much more complicated. Ficino probably interrupted his translation of Plato simply because the Corpus Hermeticum was just rather short. Further, it doesn't appear that Ficino ever sought to publish his translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, at least not as it stood. He completed the translation in the mid-1460s, but his translation only appeared in the famous Trivio edition of 1471, which was actually unauthorized. Indeed, it's come to light in recent years that the first edition is seriously flawed. Some sections seem scrambled, and there are even entire sentences which clearly appear in the original Greek, but are left out of the translation entirely. Whatever the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus were, they were best not learned from the Ficino translation, which, I can remind you, went into over a dozen editions. The crux of the myth is that early foundational editions of the Corpus Hermeticum did as much to obscure the teachings of Hermeticism as to elucidate them. In the centuries that have followed, we've learned so much more about the spiritual philosophy ascribed to Hermes Trismegistus. In this episode, we're going to survey some of the Hermetic literature beyond the 18 Hermetic tractates and the Latin Asclepius. However, if you haven't seen that first video, you may want to check it out first. Take a look at the card above for the link. By exploring the treasure trove of Hermetic Fragments and Testimonies, we will hopefully gain a better insight into Hermetic philosophy and spirituality more generally. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. Hermetic writings have come down to us through various avenues. There are the classical Greek tractates along with the Latin Asclepius, 2 excerpts and a prayer of thanksgiving recovered in Codex 6 of the Nag Hammadi Library, the considerable amount of material excerpted in the anthology of John Stobaeus, the Hermetic Definitions primarily preserved in Armenian, although there are some Greek fragments as well. There are some papyrus fragments discovered both in Oxford and Vienna, and of course there are the testimonies found in the writings of philosophers and theologians through the centuries. And finally, a wealth of so-called technical Hermetica, or works ascribed to Hermes Trismegistus that cover everything from astrology and alchemy to poison making and hydraulic technology, primarily in Arabic and Latin. In this episode, we're going to survey the non-technical Hermetic tractates beyond the standard 18 Greek tractates and the Latin Asclepius. The technical Hermetica will get another episode in the future, though I have to admit that that literature remains pretty inaccessible even today. As you probably know, Hermetic philosophy, or Hermeticism, is a spiritual philosophy attributed to the famed Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus. Exactly who Hermes was, or that he ever existed at all, or exactly what he taught varies considerably. Frankly, it's nearly impossible to talk about the Hermetic philosophy given just the variance in the state of which has come down to us. For instance, much of what survived did so primarily through Christian hands, so it must be admitted at some level that we're seeing Hermeticism through a Christian filter. Despite that, let's turn to what has survived. The largest collection of Hermetic fragments comes down to us from the anthology of the 5th century compiler John Stobaeus. In order to provide a kind of general education for his son, Stobaeus compiled hundreds of excerpts from classical literature on everything from physics, poetry, economics, philosophy, and more. In fact, some of these classical writers only survive because they were quoted by John, and that includes a substantial amount of Hermetic texts. For John, Hermes Trismegistus was a philosopher on par with Socrates and Pythagoras. The excerpts largely deal with the nature of God, the creation of the cosmos, the creation and descent of souls into bodies, the nature of providence and fate, and how one might escape it. So if you're interested in Hermetic theology or even the Hermetic conception of the energies that pervade the cosmos, the Stobaean Fragments should interest you greatly. In these fragments, the Hermetic divine is utterly transcendent and the only entity truly capable of goodness. Since the truth cannot change and we live in a world of change, only the unchanging God is true. Our physical world is fundamentally false. Therefore, we must strive to reunite with God through training our souls. Indeed, only the body is bound by fate, but divine providence allows the sage to reach back to the pure beneficence of God. The Stobaean fragments vary from a single sentence to an entire Hermetic tractate, the most famous of which is fragment 23, often called the Kore Kosmou, or the people of the universe, people as in the people of your eye. This incredibly complex text is something akin to a Hermetic version of Genesis, detailing the origin of creation, the soul and its descent into the physical body, and most importantly, how they can return to the divine. In this myth, it is the combination of curiosity and pride that causes the fallen state of humanity, though ethical and spiritual purification allow one to escape this condition. Indeed, the later Stobaean fragments deal extensively with the origin, natures, and fates of the various kinds of souls. While the Stobaean fragments do not provide a systematic account of Hermetic philosophy, no Hermetic document does this sadly, they do give us an interesting window upon foundational topics. Again, these texts also shed light on the dilemma faced in studying these texts. They too have passed through a filter. In this case, the filter of the Christian John Stobaeus, and specifically through the filter of what kind of knowledge he wanted to pass down to his son. Perhaps the closest thing we have to a systematic statement of the Hermetic philosophy are the so-called Hermetic Definitions, which are preserved primarily in Armenian. Unlike many other Hermetic texts, the definitions take the form of short aphorisms and may date to an early period in the development of Hermeticism itself. It appears that the writer of this text knew several other extant Hermetic documents, or perhaps that those documents that rely on the definitions are a text very much like it. In fact, a theory I find very plausible is that the Hermetic literature began as individual aphorisms, much like the Egyptian wisdom literature, the dialogue form coming later. One might compare these aphorisms to something like the sayings Gospel of Jesus, or Q, Quella, of which something like the Gospel of Thomas may be an echo. Weirdly enough, Gospel of Thomas Logion 67 reads, "Whoever knows the all but fails to know himself lacks everything." That exact phrase can also be found in the Hermetic definitions, so go figure. At any rate, while brief, the definitions is a fascinating systematization of Hermetic spiritual philosophy, from the nature of God to the soul, fate, self-knowledge, and the role of progressive forms of intellection in the pursuit of spiritual liberation. Although I wouldn't call the text the definitive statement of Hermetic philosophy, it is a fascinating presentation. Indeed, it's the kind of text I suspect a commentary would have filled volumes and volumes, as the definitions raise more questions than they settle. In fact, if I were to do a Hermeticism study group, it would be precisely on this text. I just wish I could read Armenian. I guess I have work to do there. The Oxford and Vienna Hermetic fragments are sadly very brief. They seem to deal with the imperishable, non-corporeal nature of the soul, the ineffability of God, and how reason separates us from non-human animals and is crucially important for the liberation of the soul itself. There's also an interesting take on how embryology, a few of what might be called Hermetic medical tracts, can also be found here and there in the fragments as well. Curiously enough, the Vienna fragment is written on one side of a piece of papyrus, while the other side details a story about Janus and Jambres, the two Egyptian magicians that sparred with Moses and Aaron. Perhaps the person that had this written out was just really interested in Egyptian things generally. We don't know, but an interesting combination of Hermetic and otherwise Egyptian Romantic literature here. The sections found in the Nag Hammadi Library are fascinating for many reasons. As you probably know, the Nag Hammadi Library is a collection of 13 papyrus books containing a host of Gnostic scriptures discovered in 1945. In Codex 6, however, several Hermetic rather than Gnostic texts have been discovered. While two of these texts were previously known, the Perfect Discourse or the Logos Teleos and the Prayer of Thanksgiving were preserved in Latin, a new text was discovered as well, the Discourse on the 8th and the 9th. This text is fascinating because it is clearly meant for a very advanced initiate into the Way of Hermes. In fact, the text says that the student has mastered all the general and detailed lectures, which, if they existed, are sadly no longer extant. This may be among the ultimate texts in Hermeticism, describing the final ascent from the physical world into the world of the divine. Indeed, it may be on those grounds that the text finds its way into the more dualistic world of the text of the Nag Hammadi Library. This text simultaneously invokes both Egyptian theogony and Hellenistic cosmology, and includes prayers and records ecstatic visions, perhaps even the phenomenological records of Hermetic disciples. In some sense, we're given a kind of undeserved peek into the ultimate heights of Hermetic spirituality. The hymn of thanksgiving also provides us a glimpse into the ritual life of Hermetic spirituality, something generally missing from the surviving texts. We also learn that they consumed a vegetarian holy meal as well. And it's also worth noting that the scribe has left a note indicating that they were remiss to include more Hermetic texts despite, quote, many having come into their hands. Again, this all points to how much Hermetic literature may have existed and how much has been lost to time, the rise of Christian hegemony, and the vicissitudes of simply manuscript history. Outside of these texts, there remain roughly 45 Hermetic fragments, that is, fragments of Hermetic texts preserved in other authors, or nearly 40 texts mentioning or describing Hermes Trismegistus or his teachings. Curiously enough, 39 of the 45 Hermetic fragments survive in Christian literature, again giving us some glimpse into the complicated relationship between Hermeticism and Christianity. These fragments range from single sentences to sustained engagement and respectful deference to the teachings of the thrice grace Hermes, to rather polemical misreadings. I'm looking at you, St. Augustine. The fragments that proved popular were those on the nature of God, the nature of the soul, the creation of the world, the divine Son of God, which is the cosmos if you read Hermetic literature closely, but with a little finessing, you can kind of squeeze Jesus in there somehow or the other. Again, this all points to the fact that what survived did so at some level because it was amenable to Christian readers. The testimonial texts span from the 3rd century BCE Jewish philosopher Artapanus, who actually conflates the persons of Moses and Hermes, to the 15th century philosopher Nicholas of Cusa, who was actually alive during Ficino's translation of the first 14 Hermetic discourses, but died prior to their publication in 1471. Here the testimonials include Hellenes, Jews, Christians, Sabaeans, and Muslims, for whom Hermes was everything from a primeval revealer of religion, an alchemist inscribing their teachings on emerald tablets, a semi-divine king of Egypt, a philosopher wielding magical powers, the inventor of hieroglyphics and astrology, and much more. Hermes Trismegistus truly becomes the origin of whatever wisdom that author cherished or feared. Of course, this small summary is no replacement for studying these wonderful texts on your own. Each one is like a facet of the jewel that is Hermetic lore, and each one reflects and refracts our idea of Hermes the thrice great and Hermetic philosophy through the cultures and ages before us. Of course, there remains much more to cover. For instance, the very controversial text, the Kybalion, is often described as New Thought wearing Hermetic clothes, but its impact can't be denied. Is it really Hermetic? Well, kinda. That's a topic for a future episode. And as I mentioned earlier, there's still a great deal more to cover. The transformation of Hermes Trismegistus into a kind of proto-scientist in the Islamic world, the rise of the technical Hermetica such as the famed Quirinides, and even the demonic book of Thoth, only recently edited and published, all deserve attention as we continue to explore the impact of Hermes Trismegistus and the spiritual philosophy of Hermeticism. If you're interested in Hermetic philosophy, magic, or alchemy, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica. Also, if you want to support my effort to provide free, scholarly, and accessible content on topics in esotericism, please consider supporting my work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. Your support does in fact make Esoterica possible, and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. If you want to consult the largest collection of Hermetic fragments, then the current edition by Litwa is definitely your best option. Unfortunately, it is still only available in hardcover and it remains rather expensive. However, I will say this text is exactly the kind of scholarship one would hope for in such a text. It has copious notes. Every single fragment gets its own introduction. There are enormous amounts of cross-references, and it's clear that Litwa has a profound knowledge of classical literature. All of this make this volume indispensable if you want to study Hermeticism. I just hope that a less expensive paperback will appear sometime soon. The Armenian definitions can be found in the inexpensive volume The Way of Hermes, which also contains the Greek Corpus Hermeticum in a lovely and accurate translation. Of course, the Nag Hammadi fragments can also be found in the newest Meyer edition of that text, with a very solid introduction for all three Hermetic texts found there. I've also included other important volumes on Hermeticism in the first episode on the Corpus Hermeticum, so make sure to check that out as well. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.